So my name is Mark Lugert. I'm going to talk about a little bit about our company and what we do, but then what we're going to do is dive into SharePoint to Alfresco migration today. We're going to talk about what things are in SharePoint, what things are in Alfresco, what can you migrate easily, what can't you migrate easily, and what those migrations kind of look like. Nothing you're going to see today is specific to SharePoint, though. I mean, any of the big ones, Documentum, FileNet, LiveLink, they all kind of go through the same process, and you have a lot of the same components. Okay, so who are we? So we have a product, and it does migrations, yes, but syncs, publish, scalability around federating Alfrescos or federating other repositories, that type of thing. We can do indexing, federated search, and then we have what's called the virtual repository, which is another use case. Okay, so our business is moving content around, finding content, stuff like that. Okay, now what does a migration look like to us? So taking some, I guess, legacy format, you'd call it, which, like I said, could be Documentum, LiveLink, SharePoint. We're gonna focus on SharePoint today, but it's any of those, And so what we do is we look at migrating users and groups and the user and group mappings and what that looks like, the content types, permissions. So this is different from ACL's access control list. This is permissions between, like in SharePoint, the roles and the way they do permissions are different than what they have in Alfresco. And then content and properties, and then the versions of those. You may want to move one or more versions of content of the content and properties. And then finally we do the ACL. So if you want to maintain permissions across systems, that's the last thing we focus on. Now what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about some of the application constructs like data list and workflows and stuff like that as well at the end. Okay, so what does SharePoint look like versus what Alfresco looks like? So this is from our discovery client. So this is our Amazon test server. Just to give you a real server, I don't want to use a customer server, but you basically have a list of servers. So a lot of sites will have, a lot of customers will have multiple Alfresco servers, and each one of those, everything in SharePoint is a site. So if you're at the root of SharePoint, you're in a site, and then all sites inherit from other sites. So there's no such thing as like a site that exists out there by themselves. Everything inherits from another one, except for the root site, which is the root. Now each site can contain lists or libraries. So you can have, like out of the boxes, templates, document libraries, stuff like that. Now some of these things you might want to migrate. Some of these things there's no use migrating. And then in each, especially in document types, in document, like shared documents or document folders, you're going to have types. So like in this case, I have a bunch of like test types, DT1, DT2, and then Simflofy as a type. And then you have the normal ones like document and folder. Okay. And then of course you have properties and stuff in the content, which we'll talk about. Now Alfresco, the reason I bring this up is because Alfresco is different. There is no one-to-one mapping between SharePoint and Alfresco. While Alfresco Share at the bottom there has sites, sites don't inherit from other sites, and they don't have all the features of a SharePoint site. Now Alfresco's also got like the Explorer client, or the repository if you're using Share, but also if you're using like CMIS connector through like Drupal or something, you're going to be using the core repository, right? Now, and then the third one you have here is Workdesk, which was added recently, right? Which is more about virtual folders, more about properties and metadata mappings, and then mapping those into virtual folders. The reason I bring this up is because in SharePoint, again, it's that whole hierarchy. It's kind of like a web file system, right? That doesn't map one-to-one. So when you work with a customer, or if you are a customer, what you have to think about is, well, how do I want to migrate this stuff, and what do I want to migrate it into, and how do I plan on using this content? How do I plan on accessing it? What I have found is that most people that use SharePoint, they don't like it. Over time, it's great for demos and stuff, but over time, it gets very cluttered when you have 1 million+ documents or something in there. So how do you do this in such a way that it's not cluttered? People can find stuff, people can do stuff, people can actually get their job done. So that's usually, there's some work to do there that no matter what our tool does, we can't tell you how you want to use the system. So there's a solution you have to come up with there. Okay. Now SharePoint content types are, for the most part, one-to-one mappings with Alfresco. There's a couple differences I'll go over. You can go in. They have a bunch of out-of-the-box ones. Frankly, they have so many out-of-the-box ones, I don't know how a user ever actually finds the ones they want to use. They can be site-specific, and customers, when they have users, actually can have the rights to create their own content types. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that if you have 5,000 sites, and you've allowed users to create your own content types, you're going to have a bunch of duplicates, and you have a lot of duplicate metadata, a lot of duplicate fields, sometimes a lot of duplicate types. And so what we need to do is kind of, when you go to Alfresco, you're going to make sure you collapse that down into whatever your model, what you really want it to be. Okay. Oh, yeah, one important thing here. SharePoint 2007 introduced content types. So before that, you really are just a web-based file system, 2003. Those are actually pretty easy migrations just because it's just content. You don't really have to worry about modeling or anything. Okay, now 2 things that they don't have. SharePoint does not have aspects. Okay, so an aspect in Alfresco is, it's not a type, it's a group of properties or relationships that can be shared across multiple types. Now there's a lot of power in that, and so you want to take advantage of that. Most likely, right? So you don't really want to do, Simflofy, the way we work is we have our discovery client that actually goes out there and finds all the types and everything, and then it actually creates the types for you for Alfresco. But that's a one-to-one mapping. So what you really want to do is take that mapping, those files that those XML files that we've generated that have the types in Alfresco, and you actually want to change those to be whatever you want the new model to be. Okay, and then Alfresco does not have calculated fields. So if you make use of that a lot in SharePoint, you have to create some custom field types in Alfresco. Okay, so now we're going to talk about content and properties. This is actually a one-to-one, right? I mean, there's nothing different. Word doc in SharePoint is a Word doc in Alfresco. Properties in SharePoint are properties in Alfresco. Except for calculated fields, they're just one-to-ones. That's not a big deal. But that said, again, because users have created a lot of stuff and you maybe not have librarians and stuff and data modelers do this, what you may want to do is actually change the names of fields going from one system to another. Or in this case, you might want to map, for instance, you may take a SharePoint type and that may be a parent type, a child type, and an aspect in Alfresco. So using our stuff, you can actually just do a mapping right here. Like this is just an example mapping. But you can just do a mapping from one system to the other using our UI. And then once that's done, you just run the job and it converts all that stuff for you. Okay, so now we're starting to get a little bit more advanced stuff. Like content and properties are fairly easy. They're fairly one-to-one. There's some content modeling you have to do. But when we start talking about taxonomy and classification, now we start talking about more advanced features, and so we're starting to move up the stack a little bit. So these were introduced in SharePoint 2010. They call them managed metadata, but effectively they are the same thing as Alfresco categories. So there's no real difference. Each product has APIs for these, so migrating these are actually pretty easy. Again, the difference though is that SharePoint's site-based, and you can do these per site. So in Alfresco, everything's global. So what we have to do is walk all the sites, find all of them, and then move those into Alfresco. Once they exist, then you can add them to a piece of content. Okay, and then there's some, just some information. If you haven't used the managed metadata, there's some information there for you. Okay. Now, users and groups. So this is usually a little bit complex. I don't really want to get into too much around this because this is, I mean, realistically, if you're talking about SharePoint to Alfresco migration, you're talking about a 3-day conversation, right? And I have 30 minutes to talk. But typically this is how it goes. They're going to use Active Directory most likely. Now, you don't have to use Active Directory with SharePoint, but 90% of people do. The advanced thing is claim-space authentication. If you're using that, that's a separate conversation. I'm not going to go into that. We can do that, but there's a different conversation there. Okay, so typically you have to import your users and groups that are in Active Directory into Alfresco using the normal Alfresco sync. The reason is this because Alfresco assigns an authority to that authorizing agent, right? So if, for instance, I were to create this stuff directly from SharePoint and then import, I'd actually have duplicate users. So you don't want that. So what we do is we import everything we can. Now, in SharePoint, just like all the other tools, you can create separate groups. You can't really create separate users, but you can create separate groups. So what we have is we have a tool that can either migrate all the users and groups for you just straight from SharePoint if you want to manage everything in Alfresco. Or what you can do is actually put it in differentiation mode. It'll actually migrate just the things that differentiate, right? So whatever's not in Active Directory, it'll move over into Alfresco, and then it'll do all those mappings for you. So I just did this for a LiveLink one. It was 8,500 users. It took 30 minutes to do the whole process start to finish. So just to give you an example what a real one looks like. But users and groups are important because you can't have permissions if you don't have principals to map into. So now the permissions are totally different in SharePoint. They're different names, different everything. But the two things to notice about SharePoint is all the time permissions inherit. You have to actually go into it and break inheritance to change the permission on things. That's actually against best practices in SharePoint. So that's okay. That's not a big deal. So we can do this. Now what we do, though, is what's called effective permissions. So what we do is we take all the inherited permissions on a document, all the actual permissions on a document, and that's what we migrate over. So when you go to Alfresco, you're not inheriting anymore those permissions. The disadvantage of that is you've lost your inheritance. The advantage of that is you can now put that content wherever you want. You don't have to maintain that folder hierarchy, and then permissions will still maintain, right? The reason we do this is because otherwise you have to actually go through, create the folder structure first, then create the permissions, have those inherit down, then move the content into those. So it ends up becoming a multi-process step, and then you're actually stuck with that hierarchy, which, like I said at the beginning, we've had some more people. When you're moving from SharePoint to Alfresco, you don't want to move, if you don't like what you have in SharePoint, you probably don't want to move it one-to-one into Alfresco. You want to take advantage of remodeling, like a house, right? So you want to do content modeling and just do some of that stuff. You want to take advantage of the fact that you can migrate permissions differently. You can migrate users and groups differently, and you can migrate folders differently, right? So we give you the power to migrate everything differently so that you can create the solution you want in Alfresco. Okay, so these are the permissions you have in SharePoint. So these are the default ones: full control, design, contribute, read, limited access. You can add more and change them depending on which version of SharePoint you're on. Okay, now these are default ones out of Alfresco. You'll notice that they don't really map one-to-one. So what we ask our customers to do is typically just give us a spreadsheet, with Alfresco on the top or Alfresco on the left and SharePoint on the right, whatever, and just tell us what they are, right? Tell us what these things map into. You just plug that mapping into the output connector on Simflofy, and it just takes care of it all for you. Okay, and the reason we ask them to do that mapping is, and we give them this spreadsheet or even an updated one. Alfresco's got tons of actual discrete permissions you can add on things as well. You can create custom permission sets. So you don't have, these are the out-of-the-box ones, but just like other tools, you can create your own in Alfresco. Okay, calendars, blogs, discussions. These are, so there's two pieces. Now we're starting to get into the application level stuff. There's actually two pieces to each of these. There's API, so the migration is actually not that hard because there's just APIs for it. However, they all have a UI component. In Alfresco, you can only have one blog, one calendar per site. So in SharePoint you can have multiple. And a lot of the SharePoint customers we have, they actually have third-party. They don't like the out-of-the-box discussion forums or especially calendars. So they may have some custom ones. So it may not be a one-to-one mapping. It may be a one-to-one mapping. It's really just going to be dependent on what people do. But the UIs are obviously going to be different. The way the products work are going to be different. So there may be some work to do. There's no real work to do around the migration of content if it's just out-of-the-box to out-of-the-box. It's more, the work is to do is around how users interact with the system, how they use it, what they want to do with it. Okay, and I group these all together because they're all kind of the same, right? They all have the same components. I mean, a calendar is a calendar. It's an event. It has a starting time, an end time, and location. Those are pretty standardized. Blogs and discussions are also pretty standardized across multiple tools. Data lists are a little bit more advanced. There are APIs for both products to do the migration. So again, the migration can be one-to-one, but you'll notice on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, so this one down on the bottom is Alfresco, and this is how so there's a bunch of them that come out of Alfresco out of the box, a bunch of different types of data lists in SharePoint. In fact, I would say Alfresco data lists come from SharePoint data list, right? But you'll notice the UIs are a little bit different. So again, when you're doing the migration, you have to take into account that the UI differences may confuse users, and so you may want to add some features or stuff to the UIs. I know some partners of Alfresco have created like specialized data lists with different UI features and stuff. So it's not necessarily you got to take into account the user experience when you do these type of migrations. Okay, so forms, workflows, dashlets, web parts, these don't map at all. These all have to be redone. The advantage of this is that you can recreate them, but a couple things. SharePoint allows users to create workflow. So it's not necessarily the folder type workflow that Alfresco has. They can do, I would say, full-fledged workflow. The problem with that is that these are typically not planned workflows. So you don't necessarily want to migrate those workflows in the first place. And then web parts are what SharePoint calls them. Dashlets are what Alfresco calls them. They're not really a one-to-one mapping. I mean, if you do web parts the way Alfresco or the way SharePoint wants you to do them, you're working in .NET. You're doing stuff that stuff will work in Alfresco, but you have to write. It's a different framework, a different templating engine, stuff like that you have to use. And then you have to worry about authentication. So SharePoint web parts have different authentication mechanisms to work with Active Directory and whatnot, and work inside SharePoint. So that may or may not work inside Alfresco. And then forms, I think there's a code way to do this automated. However, the problem is there's like 6 ways to create forms in SharePoint, and there's at least 4 in Alfresco. And so what are you really migrating? How are you migrating it? I would suggest, we talked earlier about the different ways to do stuff in Alfresco. I'm a big fan of Workdesk. So SharePoint doesn't have that. They don't have a Workdesk, right? They're just the whole site thing. So I would very much, encourage people to do something differently, right? The way they do stuff. Now the nice thing is Activity is BPM 2.0 compliant, which makes it more standardized. So you can actually do a lot of these workflows and actually standardize them, because SharePoint does not use a standardized workflow engine. Okay, what else do I got? Okay, I just got a couple things. So they asked me to mention some of the other things they use our product for, just so you can kind of get an idea, just in your environment, what we do. This is just real customer type stuff. So one of the things is syncing Alfresco production, data down to UAT, test and development to refresh, so that you're actually, so a lot of our customers, when they do development, everything's great the first time, but then customers and stuff do new things on the production system, and a lot of times when you're doing development work and you actually progress that up to, you don't actually run into bugs until you get into production, because you don't have the real environment, right? You have some mocked up environment in development, testing, UAT at that point. So that's one use case that people use our stuff for. Syncing syndicated content. So we, again, when I talked about this at the beginning, not just SharePoint. So we can do any kind of content. It doesn't matter. It's all connector based. So getting stuff from like SSH servers or file servers or websites or whatever, you can sync all that stuff into Alfresco. So one of our customers, they sync a whole bunch of stuff, content, syndicated content, either internally or externally, into Alfresco. They pipeline it, meaning they do workflow, and then they publish it out for a Drupal website. So publishing content created in SharePoint. So one of the things, this is actually pretty interesting. So a lot of times you've built applications in SharePoint, and you may have thousands of users on SharePoint or whatever, and you're like, I don't really want to pay for that. But realistically, I have like 20 authors of content, right? So can I keep them on SharePoint, but actually publish the content to Alfresco and make it available to everybody on Alfresco, or even make it available on a website somewhere for like external users? So one of our customers, what they want to do is, they've got this whole application to build these PDFs in SharePoint. They want to then publish that to Alfresco, right? So then the normal users can use it. And then they want to actually make that available through Drupal, because they want their actual end customers, which are hundreds of thousands of users, to actually be able to access that content as well. So in that case, it's more of an interoperability story. It's not really a migration. It's I just want to get my users off SharePoint because that's what I pay for, right? If I have 20 users, I don't care at that point. Migrating tens of millions of documents, so we do that. So that's like large live link migrations in SharePoint. SharePoint doesn't usually have tens of millions of documents, because at that point you've probably crashed your servers, right? Indexing content in Cloud Drive with metadata. So a lot of people use like Dropbox and stuff, but they don't. That's not really managed content out there. So trying to manage that content and add some indexes around that, add some search, add some metadata around that, so we can do that. Federating Alfresco repositories. So a lot of people have like 9 installs of Alfresco. It's like, well, how can I treat that as one Alfresco? So we can do that. It's basically sharding Alfresco at that point. Archiving of content. So we can archive it, into different Alfresco systems, into records management, whatever you want to do. That's useful because a lot of times, the content. A lot of times we'll talk to customers and they've been using a system like Documentum or SharePoint for 10 years, and they have just tons of stuff. And so it's like, well, why do you have tons of stuff in there? You never should have had that, right? Every year or every month or something, you should be cleaning up stuff that's not used and putting that somewhere where it's not cluttering up your system, but still findable, right? So we call that archiving. And using federated search or the virtual repository, depending on what your use case is, you can easily then find that stuff and it just plugs into Alfresco. Indexing content on disk drives for allowing for metadata. So I talked a little bit about that. If you have scanners that scan stuff and it's not Kofax, it's not something that integrates directly in Alfresco, a lot of times what they'll do is they just drop stuff off into a folder somewhere, and it's like a tarball with an XML file for properties. So we have a connector that just allows you to reach in and just grab all that stuff and put it in Alfresco. And then the last one is the virtual repository. This is where it's built on federated search, where you can search everything, but you can perform all the actions in our UI. So you can update properties, download content, upload content, preview content, basically everything that you can do through document management through our UI. But it could have 50 repositories on the back end. But to a user, it's one. Now the advantage there is you can do some cool things like lazy migration. That's the use case here is, I want to migrate from X to Y, but I don't really want to do a migration project, and because I really don't even know what's used in this repository. So what you say is anytime somebody performs an action on a document in this repository X, I want it to move to Alfresco real time. Okay? So that's a lazy migration. So after 6 months, anything that hasn't been migrated probably isn't used. So then at that point, you could do something like archive it or something like that, or put it into records management if it's like a HIPAA compliant type document, or if it's financial or something, you got to keep it. You may want to actually turn that into a record and archive it. Okay. So summary. A couple things I didn't mention. We are an open source platform. It's commercial open source. The reason we're commercial, meaning that you're a partner or you buy the product, you get the source code. The reason we do that is because we're a product company, so the advantage of our platform is that you buy support. We know how to do these migrations. You may not, and we can't send architects out to every single site. So most people have resources; they're pretty good. They just maybe don't know how to do migration. So what we do is we support them, we help them, we provide the expertise to your team to do those migrations. So you don't have to have the expertise. You use our product and just use our people, and then you're done. Migration, contlet, whatever that is. So migrations are more than just content, right? As we discussed, there's users, there's groups, there's permissions, right? There's type mappings. There's more than just content, more than just properties. There's folders where things exist. There's categories. There's application constructs. That's what a real migration is. And you got to take all those things into account when you plan out a migration, and you got to take into account the user experience when you do that migration. Okay. Migrations, in my opinion, should never be click and go, meaning I plug in Simflofy and I just let it do it. You can do that. That's usually a bad idea, because if you hate SharePoint, then you're just going to recreate the thing you hate on the other side. Take advantage of the things that Alfresco has, right? There's a lot of different ways to solve your problem. Alfresco does not force you to use any user experience. You can use shared drives. You can use the Adobe CMIS drive to integrate with your Adobe products. You can use CMIS through Drupal. You can use Workdesk, Explorer, Share, lots of different ways to access your content. And honestly, if you have 50 groups using Alfresco, you may have 50 different ways to access Alfresco depending on what they want to do. All that's pretty easily manageable in Alfresco. Take advantage of that. Okay? And business processes and user interface considerations really should drive the engagement, right? So it should really be about how I want the experience to be in Alfresco, rather than, you shouldn't have to worry about, so most people when we talk to them, they're super worried about just getting stuff moved because that's the hard part. So what we try to do is take care of that for you, so that what you have to do is just worry about what do I want that experience to be. So the type mapping, you may not think about that, but that is about user experience, right? What I name my properties, how that's structured is about how users interact with stuff, right? So if you have a legal document, and it inherits from another one, it has an aspect with some content on it, and that all maps together into a form for that user, well, that's a user experience, right? If that's coming from SharePoint and they got 50 types with 50 forms, and you're trying to put that all into one, that's an experience you're trying to, right? So what we care about is that experience. We have all the mapping and stuff to make that happen, but you have to tell us what that is, right? And I think that's it. So I made sure to have plenty of time for questions and stuff. Anybody have any questions on SharePoint migrations in general? What's easy, what's hard? Anybody want to go at the API level?
You mentioned the
Excuse me.
lazy migration.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit
Could you?
Okay, so for the recording and stuff, he asked lazy migrations, a little bit more about that. So we have, in fact, all of our patents are actually around this concept of a virtual repository. And what this is it's kind of like federated search. So that's usually what I relate it to. But in federated search, you can, you search multiple repositories, you can find content, but when you click on it, it takes you to that user experience. We don't do that. Instead, you stay in our user experience. It's just an HTML5 and JavaScript user interface. So customize it all you want. We don't even brand it because we expect people to customize it. That thing can sit in Alfresco, it can sit in Drupal, whatever. Now, and that hits a content services layer on our side. And so what we do is we convert the calls from Simflofy's calls into whatever that is for SharePoint, Drupal, or not Drupal, but Documentum, a file system, a database, whatever. Okay? So that's the virtual repository. So updating content, previewing content, downloading, uploading new content, all that stuff happens through that interface. Now, and we audit everything. So imagine if you hooked up 50 repositories and now you have full audit. You know everything about your content at that point. You know who's using it, what they're using, how often they're using it, with all your content. Now, what you can do in Simflofy is you set up connectors, input and output connectors. Okay, so I want to take input from SharePoint, output to Alfresco. But you can actually run that as a job, as a scheduled job. Like, so you can hit start and just have it do it. Or you can run it as a scheduled job. Or you can actually do event-based jobs, which means like when I upload a document, I automatically want that to go in Alfresco and then be indexed in Solr, right? So that's a scheduled job. The other thing is a lazy migration, which is if I actually perform a certain set of actions on a piece of content in this SharePoint repository or whatever, the action I want to take is this job that actually moves it, does the migration, but I want to do a real-time migration, right? So, and then what do I want to migrate? So obviously you have to have the users and groups and stuff all kind of similar. So if you use Active Directory everywhere or LDAP everywhere, you're perfect, you're great. If you don't, that's one of the first things we need to tackle, right? Is we either do a translation layer or we actually try to get you on the same thing everywhere. But anyway, so once you've done that, then you're only migrating documents as people use them. So if you have some like old SharePoint 2003 or something, and you're like, do I really want to migrate this? I don't know what people use it for. I don't know anything about it. That's a great way to do it because after 6 months to a year or whatever doing this, whatever hasn't been migrated, you can do probably whatever you want with, depending on your legal requirements and stuff. Does that answer your question, hopefully?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. That's actually one of the things we have patents on. Because that's pretty useful. Any other questions?
So have you ever had an opportunity to convert from a Pitney Bowes repository?
I have not.
Okay, what about converting from AFP files?
I'm sorry, what was that?
AFP files.
AFP files. I have not personally, no.
In one of your Simflofy use cases, you said synchronizing from Alfresco production to UAT and test, right?
Yeah.
Is it at a repository level or at a content type level?
Both.
Both?
Yeah. Everything I showed you, we can do all that. So you can migrate users, groups, everything. Yeah.
And same thing for archiving?
Yep. Yeah. So the way our stuff works is through the UI, and again, I didn't really want to demo the product, but maybe I should have. Through the UI, you just choose what you want to do. So whatever you want to do. Users and groups and stuff tend to be a one-time thing, so that's a different job. But like for versions and properties and stuff, it's at the job level. So you just set up the job to do whatever you want to do. So if you want to migrate, if you want to like archive like the latest 5 versions and the latest, and then delete everything else, then you can do that. As an example. And you get all the properties, all the types, everything.
So while say if you are archiving content of a content type on a production servers, and if that repository has other content types where users are using it live, won't it impact the performance of other content types?
What do you mean? Oh, so he's asking, will impact the performance of other content types?
Like for example, a repository has 10 custom content types,
okay,
and I want to purge or archive 2 of them, which are very high volume. So while I am doing the archiving on a business during the business hours using your tool, won't it impact the access?
Yeah, will archiving impact performance? So first of all, you may not want to do archiving like that. You may want to do it on a nightly basis, and then just use like a CMS query to say everything that's older than X number of days and of this type. So you can just use a CMS query to select the content, first of all. And second of all, you can, using our product, you can actually, you can put thresholds on it. So only do so many bytes per second or something like that. Actually, it's bytes per minute is what you do. So you can do that as well if you want to make it so it doesn't crush your system. But normally we tell people to just do that stuff at night or off hours. I mean, it doesn't have to be real time. Typically, those aren't event-based. if that even works.
Hi, could you explain a bit more about how the product works? For instance, is it done, do you set up scripts from command line? Do you actually have a console interface?
There's a console interface.
Okay.
Yeah, you set up everything through the user interface, and what you do is you configure your connectors to, which has like all the server information, login information, stuff like that, and then you create jobs that use those connectors. And then the jobs have like the metadata mappings, have the field, the folder mappings, all that kind of stuff through the job. And then you can either just run that job, you can schedule it, or you can do it through an event based system through the API.
Okay. You mentioned Seamless a minute ago. Is that what you're using? Is that the mechanism you're using for?
So for getting content into Alfresco, we have a BFS connector, which is a bulk file system connector, and we have a Seamless connector.
Okay.
So it's just all about connectors, and you can write your own connector, and most of our partners and customers.
Well, I can't. But
most of our partners and customers take our connectors, and then they do whatever they want with them at that point, right? And then we help them and support them. We have developer support, level support. So.
Okay.
So we kind of expect people to take our stuff in. The platform is the important piece, and the support's the important piece. The connectors are how you connect everything together, but you can do with those what you want per engagement, right? So if you want things to work something different than what we do out of the box, the key thing is we have 5 types of connectors per thing. So depending on what you're trying to do, there may be 5, but each of those 5 does a very specific thing. So it's usually very easy to change that one specific thing. Like one of them is going and getting content. That's usually just a query. That's very easy. You don't have to do all 5 aspects of a connector. So you just change the one that you want, and then that's what you do. So and the reason we do those 5 is it sounds complicated, but it's actually way less complicated, right? Because we try to split up the work so that they do whatever those connectors do, they do it very, very well, but it's very discrete in what they do.
So each connector is optimized to do
that one specific
simple thing very well.
Yeah, you don't have to write. You're not writing a connector that goes off and gets users and groups and properties and permissions and everything, and then has to move that to Alfresco at the same time. That's not how it works. It's you have one that goes and gets permissions and everything. You have one that goes and gets this, and then you can chain those together. And I mean, typically when you do users, groups, and permissions, you do that once. You don't do that every time. And then what happens in the connector that goes and gets stuff, it usually just pulls in the ACLs. It has no idea about the mapping to Alfresco. It doesn't even know you're going to Alfresco. It doesn't care. So that just sends everything through Simflofy and Simflofy's method of doing things. And then what we do is a conversion on the back end that says, oh, here's my property mapping. I'm going to run that. Okay, I'm using Seamless. So now I'm going to convert to Seamless and it does that. So does that make sense?
Yes.
And those connectors all exist. So if you have like some other system that maybe we haven't even talked about today, and you want to convert to Alfresco, all you have to write is that one little piece that knows how to do whatever that is, and then everything else is already done for you. Like as an example, I'm working with a partner, Armedia, on a government project, and I wrote them a connector real fast. Took me like 2 hours. Write a connector that can actually go in and to those Dropbox files and actually bring in scanned documents. So I wrote the connector in 2 hours. Now all he had to write was one little piece, a parser class that knows how to understand that XML metadata file, and actually he doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to convert the names or nothing. All he does is just create it. All it does is reads in the properties file, adds those to a repository document, which is our bean, adds in a stream for the actual content if he wants to, and he sends that on to us. We take care of all the other stuff. Through the job, now you can take you'll show those property mappings, and you can actually connect those to whatever you want that to be in Alfresco. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
yes, it does.
Yeah, so in a couple hours, we were able to convert from some system we had never seen before into Alfresco very easily.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Anything else? We have the competitive analysis here for Alfresco and nothing?
I have my list.
I was going to say this to last because it may not be relevant, but based on your business model and the use cases that you provided and considering this an Alfresco summit, how many SharePoint migrations have you done to Alfresco, and what was the predominant reason for that migration?
So we've done like 2 or 3. We're a pretty young company. We've been around for a year and a half. We've done a little bit more on the like live link documentum side and stuff like that. SharePoint, we've done a few of them. The predominant reason for moving from SharePoint is 2. One, they're using a real old version of SharePoint, and they don't, like 2003 or something, and they just left it there and they don't really use it. The other reason is because, so there's a joke that I tell. Every time I talk to somebody that has SharePoint, I tell them a joke. And this joke actually comes from SharePoint users. They actually told it to me. And that joke is real short and sweet, and I put it in SharePoint. Right? So the full joke, the full statement is, hey man, I need that document from you. Where'd you put it? I put it in SharePoint. And it's like, oh, crap. What? Can you email it to me? Right? And the reason is because SharePoint demos really well. It's got 1 million features, and that's its strength. The bad thing about SharePoint is it demos well and it has 1 million features. And customers can do anything they want with it. And it's almost never, I call it unmanaged content, right? They end up having 5,000 sites. I'm not joking. I mean, I've talked to people that have like 250,000 sites. And it's like, okay, I mean, what are you going to do with that, right? I mean, can you search across all that? No. Do you have a common metadata model across that? No. Okay, well, how can you call that content management, right? So, and that's the problem these companies have, is they'll have tens of thousands of users, millions of pieces of content. They'll have dozens of SharePoint servers, and there's no actual management there. They can't find anything. They can't do their work. And so then people end up getting worried about, if you're like a C or C++ programmer, it's like worried about memory and strings instead of worrying about your application logic. It's the same thing, right? You're worried about content management at that point. And if you want to take like Apple and Facebook's type of models, you want to do content management without worrying about it. That's why I like Workdesk. You log in, you see what you're supposed to see, you get your job done, you move away. You're not thinking about content management at that point. You don't know or care that you're doing content management. What you care about is I need a document, I need to process that document, I need to do something with it. Oh, hey, look, my queue's empty, I'm done. Right? I've done my job, workflow's moved on, and I don't have to worry about anything else. I can go golf or whatever, right? Instead of spending half my day looking for content.
Thanks, and appreciate the Workdesk plug. That's
I'm interested in that too. We brought Workdesk to one of our customers, and I don't know if I'm allowed to mention them, but yeah, and they love it. So,
thanks.
Wow, I left too much time for questions. You said you had a list of questions. Do we have any other questions on migrations?
What do you think is the biggest pain point that you see during this migration, and do you have any tactics for solving that, or kind of
biggest pain point for migrations? Yeah, so the biggest pain point is what I was trying to focus on, which is the user experience.
Yeah, and how do you kind of work around that, or do you have any solutions?
Yeah, I think that's a normal solutions process, right? Explain it, stop trying, I try to tell the customer, stop thinking about content. The fact that you're thinking about this means that's your problem, right? Tell me what you're trying to do. What are your business processes? Have you mapped those things out? Do you understand what those look like, right? What are your customers or your end users really trying to do? And let's solve the problem that way. So then we'll choose the appropriate interfaces and the appropriate solution based on that. And then we can migrate to that pretty easily usually. But that's really like a business analyst type of position where you have to figure out what you're using, plan out what you really want to do, so your customers do exactly what they need to do.
Do you run into a lot of situations where people are really not wanting to deal with that planning ahead and that organizational component? Or
Yeah, so the question is, again for the recording, do we run across a lot of times where people don't want to do planning ahead or haven't done planning ahead? And the answer is yes. Typically, that's why their content management systems are the way they are. And is the mess they are, because they haven't done any planning. And a lot of that's because they've had partners or implementations that haven't helped them do the planning either. They don't, they're not necessarily experts in that stuff, so you have to kind of train them. One of my stories is always about web content management, right? So you'll have content, products like Day come in there and they show you all this WYSIWYG stuff and everything. It's like great, right? You talk to the customers a year later and they hate it, and it's like, well, why? Well, because all this WYSIWYG stuff gets in my way. I modify the file once and I never touch it again, but now I have to go in and screw with this every single time. I just want to be able to go in and I got hundreds of pieces of content to edit, and I have to do it through this WYSIWYG, right? So my point is that certain things demo well, certain things work well. And what we try to get customers to do is understand what works well as opposed to what demos well. I had a customer, and we went to Workdesk, and they're like, oh, well, we want to do this WYSIWYG stuff. Can we do that? I'm like, no, you can't. Like, I'm your architect, and I'm telling you right now, I've done over 100 Alfresco deployments. Trust me, you're going to be really upset with that solution in a year, because you're going to touch it once, you're never going to touch it again, because getting even a bug fix into production is really hard some places, right? Much less modifying a UI that hundreds of thousands or millions of customers see. Give me a break, right? So again, not to pick on Day or anything, but the point is, help customers figure out what actually works. What do they use? One of the problems with SharePoint is that it has 10,000 features. I've never used more than 10, probably. So what's the point? If you got to go through 300 content types to figure out to create a piece of content, and then your users have created hundreds or thousands of pieces of content types, you can't actually create content then. right? You've cluttered up your system so bad, and that's what we run into. So what we try to help customers learn is content management, to learn how to actually manage their content, their types, and everything.
I feel like you brought up the migration window a little bit, and I feel like that would be kind of a deterrent in some situations. Is that an issue for some people, you know, just worrying about that timetable, or it's just not that long?
From a SharePoint, it wouldn't be that long because you can't have that much content in SharePoint. You know, if you're doing like 500 servers or something, it would take a while, but you can move them one by one. It's really about planning what that migration looks like, and it's really about planning. So like a lot of times we'll talk to users, move a group at a time in their content. So we'll do like in LiveLink we'll do folder based. In SharePoint you might do site based migrations and do them one at a time. If they're trying to go to a brand new system, like they're trying to just replace it with Alfresco, one of the options is to use the virtual repository and lazy migration and just move to Alfresco day one, and just use the virtual repository user interface instead, plugged into Alfresco, and then create all new content in Alfresco. And then as they start using stuff, then you can, and again that what that user experience can be whatever you create. But then the stuff moves over behind the scenes, and they never actually see it, right? So you have options on how to plan this stuff.
Does this also handle merging of content types?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, that's actually one of the powers of it. Yeah, and it just more general. So he asked does this handle the merging of content types? I would say a more general statement is this allows you to create a new folder hierarchy, a brand new set of content types with aspects and everything, and allows you to migrate to that. Yes.
And if the content is encrypted, does it also handle encrypted?
Not out of the box. I mean, but you could add that pretty easily. But that's going to be very specific to your algorithm and how you want to do it. And the question is, do you want it unencrypted? Right? You may just want to move it encrypted and then just move the keys over to Alfresco, and then through the UI plug in whatever it is you use to unencrypt on the fly.
No, but that's not out of the box. You have to configure it to unencrypt and then encrypt it back onto the new.
If you wanted to, but I mean, you could move it encrypted. I mean, that's it's just encrypted bytes, right?
I see.
With a sign, signature or whatever. So you could move that. Yeah, that'd be fine. It was just in the UI. You would then have no way of viewing that content in Alfresco. So you would have to, whatever viewer you had on the other side. That most of the time, what happens is it unencrypts it on the fly if you have access to it, right? Whatever that is would have to be moved over to however you're using it in Alfresco. Which again doesn't necessarily have to be Alfresco's UI. I mean, technically speaking, you could use all your content in Alfresco and use it in SharePoint. I mean, that's an example. I mean, that's an option too, right?
Do you preserve your metadata like creation date, modify date?
We can, yes. Yeah. So, and we can do that through CMIS. You have to just turn off some stuff in Alfresco to during the migration to make that work. Or the bulk file system import tool actually does do that. So depending on which one you're using. And we're working with Alfresco to do a streaming bulk file system import. So you can actually, instead of having to do it through the file system, you can actually just stream it through an API. So that'll be another option. So you have two options to move into Alfresco. Because CMIS doesn't support everything. But bulk file system does or can, right? Like our version of the bulk file system, it supports permissions or ACLs as an example. So you can migrate those ACLs over. Because we work a lot at healthcare and financial companies, so obviously security is a big issue with them. So. Rich? Oh, great. Now we get a consultant asking questions.
Throughout your experience doing a lot of these migrations, what is the one thing you would tell customers considering a migration, before they do it, to kind of keep them from, making a common mistake that you see all the time?
Common mistake I see all the time. The common mistake is, the biggest common mistake is, oh, migrations are easy. I just want to I just want to move content. They're not thinking through all the other things that they have to do, the business processes, the content types, the modeling, the folder structure, the actual use cases of the users. Most people just say, I have this old repository, I just need to get stuff off. Well, if you're not using it today, then why? That didn't make sense to me, right? So why don't we find out a solution that actually works for people and actually will make people use the content? And if they're not using it and you got to store it, well, just archive it, right? Which is an easier use case. So yeah, that's usually the mistake I see, is that people underplay how hard migrations are. We try to make it easier, but migrations are still difficult if you do it correctly. As you know, you've done a bunch of them.
Last question.
Okay.
If you do have content that hasn't been managed well, and it's content that you don't want to just archive, you actually want it, do you need to go through a cleaning up of, identifying what you want, or would you move it over to Alfresco and then use tools to do that? Or?
Yes, so typically what we do is use our discovery. So the question is, if you have unmanaged content, but you want to manage it now or do a better job of managing it, and just to be clear, everybody has unmanaged content, right? Everybody uses file systems. I have stuff all over Google Drive, let me tell you. So the easiest way to do that, use our discovery client, generate all your types into Alfresco. Like if you go from Salesforce out of the box, there's 120 types. If you go from SharePoint, there's a bunch too. So basically, use all that, figure out the ones you use, and now what you do is actually now you start figuring out, okay, this is actually what my data model looks like. What does my data model need to look like? Convert that. Now you can actually manage. Now you can actually do the migration into that data model. Use Workdesk as an example to actually manage your stuff through virtual folders as opposed to real folders based on your metadata, and boom, in a few months you're actually up and running with managed content. That's a fantastic solution actually to that problem. It's where you have to like migrate workflows and stuff where you start getting a little bit more complicated because it's like, well, what does that look like and how many systems you going across and stuff like that. Workflows can be very complex. But if it's just content and properties and versions and stuff, migrating to Alfresco using Workdesk, great. Okay. Okay, I think we're done. Yeah, we good? Okay, thank you.